Good evening, good morning, good afternoon. I hope it's not night for anybody. Welcome to the third webinar in a series organized by the World Agriculture Forum's Group on Sustainable Agriculture Practices, which is led by and curated by my fellow World Agriculture Forum Global Council member, Adel Zekat Tahiri. Adel is also online today, very modestly in the background. I'm going to give you a short introduction, but today's webinar will be taken up mostly by my colleagues, my very distinguished colleagues, Meine van Noordwijk, who you see on the screen, and Catherine Muturi, who's still hiding in the background. So just as an introduction, we're talking about agroforestry today. And really, before the advent of what we call today modern agriculture, almost all agriculture was agroforestry. In other words, it involved the combination of trees, crops, and livestock. There's Catherine online as well. So those are my two colleagues. And today, in the face of the multiple crises that we face on our small planet, and I'm not just thinking of climate change or biodiversity loss, but the gross and wasteful use of water and precious soil resources, agroforestry offers hope. Offers hope not just in terms of the ecosystem services, but in terms of offering dignified and resilient livelihoods in our rural spaces. And these are livelihoods not just on the margins to support subsistence, but really to help generate much better income through higher value production. Meine will speak about land equivalent ratios and the like. So it is really a viable path, which is why the three Rio conventions have all recognized a central role for agroforestry as a strategy to thrive on our small planet. So more on agroforestry will come first from Meine and then from Catherine. So let me turn first to introduce briefly Meine. And I'm going to keep my introductions brief because you can read up about these luminaries on the web. There's lots to read about them. They are extremely distinguished scientists in their own right. Meine will start and with his usual gusto will paint with a large palette on a very, very large canvas what agroforestry is all about. He is a distinguished scientist and one of the people I consider as a leading light in agroforestry. Before he retired from ICRAF, he led the science at ICRAF. He is also a professor of agroforestry at Wageningen University. He has a PhD in agricultural science from the University of Wageningen and an MSc from Utrecht. He has published on a huge number of issues. I was just looking up his Scholar Google record. It's over 51,000 citations, 20,000 of them, or more than 20,000, just in the last 5 years. So, it is a real pleasure to have you here, Meine, and we look forward to what you're saying. Meine is based mostly in Indonesia or in Europe, but he did start out his career in Sudan for 2 years in Africa. And that's where we are welcoming Catherine Muturi today from. She is a distinguished colleague at ICRAF and C4 ICRAF and is by training an ecophysiologist. And has worked extensively on the science of agroforestry across the African continent. And she will bring to us a lot of the insights from those studies, from the evidence about what agroforestry can offer to the global community and smallholder farmers right across Africa. So that will have to suffice as introduction. I will come back briefly at the end of the presentations to offer some remarks before we get into a session. Each presenter will have roughly 20 minutes. If they can keep themselves to 20, 22 minutes, that would be excellent. And so without further ado, and I will disappear off your screens, it's over to Maina. Those of you who wish to make comments, offer insights, please do use the chat function. Otherwise, please mute your microphones. Maina, over to you.
Where do I unmute? Yes. Okay. I think that would work here. Sorry about that. Yeah. So thank you, Ravi. So today we speak about agriculture and ecosystem services with or without agroforestry. And I think it's clear that agriculture depends on ecosystem services, at the same time provides ecosystem services, and that in the context of climate change, this debate on ecosystem services is only getting more prominent. On one hand, we see the forest with its carbon stock leading to large emissions where forests get converted to agriculture. On the adaptation side, we see that that's mostly about water and about surface runoff and water sufficiency and droughts and what happens with our springs and our groundwater. But increasingly, we need to understand the nitrogen, carbon, water cycles across the whole landscape. And we need to make a link between that forest, that agriculture. And actually, in several countries, we broke down the wall between, and we have agroforestry in between. So we instead of dichotomy forest versus agriculture, we have a continuum of forest, agroforestry, open field agriculture. And that will be the focus of my introduction today. So yet there are only a few countries that have formal policies for agroforestry. And in many cases, it is sort of left in between the agriculture and the forestry way of viewing the world. Yet trees in multifunctional landscapes linked to income, to food, to health, to gender equity, to water, to energy, and fairness, climate change. So actually all of the sustainable development goals are somehow at stake in our debate, so we better pay attention. So a world without agroforestry, that's our starting point. And in that world, forestry and agriculture each have their own history, their own ministries, departments, faculties, disciplines, lobby groups, platforms, policies, mostly on the forest side, markets, mostly on the agricultural side. And okay, that can go on like that. And we can think of the landscape as being large blocks of either agriculture or forestry. Hey, there are things in between. We have plantation forestry and we have tree crop plantations that might look quite similar, but are treated as two parts of that continuum. Hey, what is rubber? Is it agriculture or is it forestry? Now, interestingly, it is the value chains and the consumers who care not only about the quality of the product, but about the mode of production that have raised issues about water, fertilization, pest control, and increasingly deforestation that link the agriculture products to what happened with the forest in that same landscape. And so it is that new part that causes some trouble with the existing way of dividing the world into separate parts. Same time, we see that Ravi referred to we started off agroforestry was the default everywhere, but we've seen in many parts of Europe, in many parts of North America, Australia, around coarsening of the mosaic. We have large blocks of pure agriculture, large cities, large areas designed for forest alone, and we've come out of that finer grained mosaic. Yet there is a strong movement back towards the more integration of functions, the ecological intensification, making use of positive interfaces between trees and agriculture. And we have that debate about integrate, segregate in the discussion on land sharing, land sparing, that I'll come back to later. So instead of just forest agriculture, we need at least 4 things on our maps. We need urban areas, we need open field agriculture, half open agroforestry plantations, and natural forest. And the concept of ecosystem services is mostly based on nature-based solutions for human problems, so from nature to the humans. But in fact, it is a cascade where the forest interacts with the half open, and half open with the open field agriculture with the urban domain. So rather than a single concept of ecosystem services, it is a complex cascade in its own right. Agriculture, as you discussed in the World Agriculture Forum, can be seen from the perspective of the products, of food product and food sufficiency, and the increasing demand of 9 billion people and everything around that, and are we meeting that? Or it can be seen from the perspective of the farmers and of the livelihoods in rural areas and the land use and the ecosystem services. Similarly, forestry, and as it is discussed for example, in the UN Forum on Forest, can be seen as an issue about wood production. In the past, it was the masts for the ships, and the Navy was involved, or the logging, or the pulp and paper production, or the firewood. So from a production perspective, can also focus on the landscape and the people living in those landscapes, and what they do and how it links to ecosystem services. Now, when it comes to the ecosystem services and the livelihoods, it makes a lot of sense to study those things together, because they're often the same landscape, and farmers may be involved in the forest, and forest people may be involved in farming. So we are better off with a more joint discourse on what's going on and how it can improve. So agriculture is about the crops and the livestock and the mechanization and the fertilizer and the industrial inputs. Forestry is about the timber, but there's a lot of things in between, and they both interact with the climate, they both interact with the water, the pollinators and the pests and the agrobiodiversity and soil conservation. And that interface between agriculture and forestry is where our agroforestry discussion comes in. So in a book a couple of years ago, when agroforestry was entering its 5th decade as a formal science, we described the AF-null, the separation of agriculture and forestry, AF1 as the concept of specific technologies happening on the interface of agriculture and forestry, but how that gradually evolved into an AF2, a concept about landscapes, about rivers flowing, and quality, quantity, floods and droughts, and the much broader intersection of agriculture and forestry with many things happening and many drivers on the forest in the agriculture side, and vice versa. And even that was not the end point. We went on to this AF3, the concept about policies. And is it so that is there a larger thing embracing both agriculture and forestry in terms of land use, water use, rights of using resources on this planet, where we have urban and peri-urban areas coming in as well? And so we've seen the broadening of the perspective of what agroforestry is, and yet it all operates within the same definition. Now, the history of agroforestry goes back a long time. Any frugivore primate disperses and thus promotes the fruit trees that they like to eat. And the footprint of our great ancestors, here we see the Australopithecus afarensis in the Nairobi National Museum, the footprint was not only left in the mud, but was also left in the composition of the forest and in the presence of fruit trees that were promoted by, at the same time, the half-open forest conditions that people liked to create. So we see a lot of the fruit trees playing a big role in various forms of agroforestry, and there is sort of very natural association with people. And as I said, that started before agriculture and is still part of what we cherish, what we appreciate and what we want to promote. So, we are dealing with the interaction of at least 3 knowledge systems: the local ecological knowledge, where farmers have a lot to say about trees, and trees, interacting with trees is older than agriculture. And the modeler's ecological knowledge, the science, the economics, the social science of agroforestry, which is, yeah, as I said, about 50 years old by now, and the public policy discourse, where agroforestry still hardly exists in many of the contexts that we want to discuss. So our role as a scientist is, first of all, to interact with the farmers and with the local ecological knowledge, and yeah, discover what exists, discuss with people what they think about it, and see where and how things could be done better. Our interaction with the policy is, first of all, that agroforestry exists and it is worth taking into account. And at the same time, our role is in that interaction between public policy and local knowledge, where there often is a lot of discussion, a lot of conflict over what farmers are allowed to do in what is considered to be forest. And we moved within that, after describing the knowledge systems and their dynamics, and we moved from what usually is seen as a decision support framing to what we called a negotiation support framing. So it is in that interaction between the local stakeholders and the public policy that as science we can help to clarify the debate and in many cases support the local perspectives on how resources can be managed within the given context. So when it comes to landscape, we tend to use this cascade model. So there is, on the ecological side, the structure and the function, and that's often about the trees. And on the social side, it is about the rights and the benefits and the value, with ecosystem services as the interface of these two. Now, on the social side, forest is mostly an institutional concept that clarifies rights and often restricts rights. So a landscape discussion separates the vegetation perspective on forest from the institutional perspective. So there are three types of agroforestry. The first is the plot level technical mixing up of everything, as it is often said, the combinations between crop, livestock, trees, and healthy soils and climate. On the landscape scale, we have the perspective on ecosystem services and social ecological systems. And on the policy side, we deal with issues and goals, sustainable development goals being a primary one. And on the knowledge side, the context that determines which options exist and how we interface on that front. So it seems to be three different things, and yet they're all connected to the same definition. Our simplest definition is agroforestry is the interface of ag and for. You can't hardly do simpler than that. But at the plot level, that has a certain interpretation. At the landscape scale, it has a slightly different interpretation. And at the policy level, it is about a harmonization of land use across the continuum. Many forms of agroforestry. Yeah, we have the fruitful home gardens producing the fruit for the family and something to sell on the market. The Swidden fallow, where the temporary dwelling in the Swidden became the starting point of the fruit trees in the fallow secondary forest vegetation. The enriched fallow, the agroforest, where commercially interesting non-timber forest products find a place, be they resins, be they benzoin, be they medicinal products. The improved fallow, where we, instead of waiting for natural regeneration, we plant trees with higher growth rates as improved fallow or as fodder bank. The shade and mulch systems of the Hessa in the Mediterranean, the parklands in the Sahel, the hedgerow intercropping in some of the humotropics. The thorny hedgerows that silvopastoral, where these are separating out and can help play a role in fire control. The shaded tree crops, the coffee, cacao, rubber, even oil palm, that actually benefits from companion trees. The smallholder timber, where especially high-value timber can be very profitably combined with mechanized wheat, as you see here in experiments in southern France 20 years ago. The infiltration-friendly land use system that allows farming on slopes to take place. The contoured filter strips that deal with erosion and sedimentation. the riparian buffer filter the fish and wood chips where fish and wood thrive together. And the trees with their wet feet in the peat as a solution for paludiculture on the peatlands. So many things and many different forms of it. And yeah, agroforestry is at least as diverse as agriculture, because all open field crops can be part of agroforestry, at least as diverse as the forest, because any tree can be grown. And yeah, agroforestry being an umbrella term, we have to be very careful that positive properties of a specific form of agroforestry in one place should not lead to the expectation that all agroforestry everywhere does the same thing. And when we make a list of all the benefits of agroforestry, that tend to be a shopping list. For each of them, there is some evidence somewhere, but the claim that all agroforestry is good for everything is definitely not to be trusted. In dealing with the livelihoods and the people, of course, we first of all deal with identity and with the local institutions, with motivation to stay in rural areas or move to the city, gender diversity, youth, values, but that interacts with at least the 5 petals of this flower: the rights, the know-how, the markets, the local environmental issues, and the global teleconnections. And the traditional concern of agronomy about the genotype by environment, by management interaction need to be seen in this much broader perspective of the multiple targets and the multiple objectives. Now, our flower looks a bit like the pentagon of the livelihood capitals from 30 years ago. But I think the identity in putting that in the center, is somewhere in between the social and the human capital, is, I think, a step forward. Oh, sorry. Interestingly, trees link to identity, to rights, to know-how, to markets, to local environmental issues, to teleconnections. So trees actually are a very interesting starting point for discussing this broader connectivity of livelihoods in landscapes with what the various local and external stakeholders think about it. Ravi made the point, agroforestry is mainstream. From a study, a pantropical study, we see a relationship between tree cover from 100% to 0% and the log of population density, so 1, 10, 100, 1,000 people per square kilometer. And we see basically two themes in that. There is the more people, less forest tendency that goes from 100% forest to maybe 40% forest. But there is also the more people, more trees storyline, and that happens out here. And it takes us from 0 to 20% forest. And the highest population densities are in landscapes that may have 20 to 30% tree cover. And that's different from what many people think, that the forest people keeps declining. From surveys of tree cover in what the FAO considers agricultural land, we found 43% of that land has at least 10% tree cover in 2010. And the most recent data that are yet to be published suggests that it actually has kept increasing over the last decade. So trees are a normal part of the agricultural landscape, and we need to justify ignoring them in open field agriculture, rather than that we have to justify that we look for agroforestry rather than agriculture without trees. We can look at the agroecological zones, we can look at the different stages of the forest transition, and only stage 1 is not agroforestry, but is pure forest. And we see all stages exist in all ecological zones. And it is that intersection that gives us some form of things that are similar and comparable to each other, and in which there can be some meaningful exchange of the dynamics that we observe. An old debate, or relatively old debate, is the land sparing versus land sharing, where land sparing has been mostly associated with intensively managed monocultures, with closing yield gaps, and keeping more space for other things like conservation, whereas land sharing has been mostly associated with multifunctional land uses. It is, however, The main metric for land sharing is the land equivalent ratio, is very similar to the yield gap, but as soon as the LER is above 1, we have a negative yield gap, and that is a challenge for agronomists to understand. So as soon as the LER is above 1, it is more efficient to have multifunctionality rather than single function monocultures. And the data that agroforestry often had LER values above 1, but we have documented 1.5, 1.8. And the interesting conclusion is that land sharing may be the ultimate way of achieving the goals of land sparing. And that's something to be debated in this forum, I think. Same time, we see that large commitments to forest restoration, to forest landscape restoration, can very well be tuned towards the agroforestry, because the forest ways of expanding plantation forestry don't have a particularly good track record, either socially or ecologically, and giving people rights to resources, allowing them to grow the trees that they like, is a much more positive perspective, as is documented here in more detail for Brazil's Cerrado and Caatinga, but similar stories are emerging across any of the tropical continents. In the debate on agroecology, we've seen a formulation of many different principles. Some are about ecological transformations, some are primarily about social transformations. And if you would take a closer look at that, we'll see that agroforestry actually is a very positive way of the interface between the ecological and the social side of what people want from their agricultural landscapes to be ready for the future. This may look like a forest, but by the definition of the FAO, by the definition of the European Union, agroforestry is not part of the forest, and any involvement of agriculture is a disqualifier for forest conditions. So it looks like a forest, and on the remote sensing-based maps, it is probably mapped as a forest, but there is a problem with the new rules for the European Union deforestation-free production. There is collateral damage. Anything agroforestry that looks like a forest is now treated with suspicion in the European markets, and there's a strong negative selection to agroforestry in traders, as we heard in several countries. So we published a paper this year on the collateral damage aspect of the EUDR. We published a paper on beyond the maps, what type of evidence could be brought to the debate to show that agroforestry is actually compliant with the objectives of the deforestation-free rule, even if it seems to be in contrast with the most common used evidence. India was the first country that wanted an explicit agroforestry policy, and that opened up the question, what is then the definition of agroforestry? And there was one view that agroforestry is part of agriculture. And we have the TIF, the trees in the forest, interacting with the TOF, the trees outside forest, or the trees on farm, depending on how you want to interpret the acronym. But the poor trees may not know themselves where they belong. The alternative view is that agroforestry is part of the forest, and it is actually the socially acceptable interface between forest and communities. It's social forestry. It is allowing the farming of agroforest as long as we recognize them as forest and as long as they stay on the statistical side as part of the forest domain. So an agroforestry policy, does it need two walls, one wall with agriculture, one wall with forest? Luckily, in India, they came to another conclusion that we actually need a more embracing concept. We need rules that it is a continuum, and we don't want the rules for agriculture to harm the forest. We don't want the rules for forest to harm the agriculture. And a consequence of that policy has been, for example, the relaxation of trade rules for farm-grown timber. And that is a big success by any of the evidence that we see, that poplar on farm-grown poplar is now 70% of the wood requirements in Indian societies. And we have similar stories from Indonesia, where some of the deregulation occurred. So the view is not to create more walls, but to create a more functional continuum. And I think that's a challenge for all other countries to follow this pathway and not to be trapped in the definitional dichotomies. So we see two different ways. If you have evidence that a certain agriculture practice, with or without trees, achieves positive outcomes in a specific place, we can declare that that tree is a silver bullet tree and that we should make sure it can grow everywhere, and we modify the environment by fertilization and drainage and irrigation to match the conditions of that tree, and we expect our G by M interaction to work like the Green Revolution worked on dole and rice. Or we can say, no, it's very interesting that this works here. Let's try to understand the theory of place and the theory of change. Why does it work here? What principles are involved? And how can these principles travel? How can they be used elsewhere to find and identify different things that would work similarly in other places? So these are two radically different perspectives on complexity. The first is about managing complexity by reducing it. And most of agricultural research has been in that box. And the second is managing the complexity by embracing it and try to say, well, actually many positive aspects that we could embrace. And that's the agroforestry tradition has been mostly on the second side of things. So we see our three concepts of the plot level agroforestry and the resource use efficiency that it entails, contributing to the multifunctional perspective on the landscape, which itself contributes to the policy discourse on how can we achieve all these goals. And each goal separately would take too much land. Hey, but we have a land equivalent ratio that interactions are possible. But the critical view is what policies do in terms of the sticks, the carrots, and the sermons. And it can very well have negative consequences on farmer decision the way it is done now. And we need to constantly review the rules of the game and see whether they can be improved to become more functional. Because the needs of society change with time. In a study of the Brantas Basin, 20 million people in East Java, in the past it was about how to how to make sure the volcanoes don't get angry, how to have the spiritual value of the water in the springs. But then it became, the mountains were the source of water for the rice. I'm almost done. Yeah.
Time check for you, just.
Yes, 1 minute, and this is the last slide. Yeah, so then we moved on to mountain livelihoods and now to ecosystem services where the people from Surabaya come to enjoy. So yes, we're doing interesting work with games on that multiplicity of goals and decision making. There's lots to read, but let's go for more specific evidence on the African continent from my colleague, Dr. Catherine Muturi. Thank you.
It's all yours. Please start. Thank you very much, Maina.
Good evening, everyone. I hope you can see my slides. Are they visible, Ravi? Okay.
Yes.
Yeah, so thank you very much. And following up to what my colleague Maina has already presented, I'm going to dive straight into the presentation. And my presentation is mainly going to be divided into 3 phases. We'll just explain more about why agroforestry, the evidence of agroforestry in terms of providing ecosystem services, and then examples of real work we've done on the ground to support the same. It's refusing to move. Okay, so why agroforestry? Now, over time, we have seen the importance of agroforestry in terms of deforestation, challenge of climate change, dealing with land degradation, food insecurity, and sustainable value chains and biodiversity loss. And I have whatever you are seeing on the slide, that is our work which we did in Rwanda around Lake Karago, where we carried out tree growing, having the right trees in the right places, and working in a participatory way with farmers. And you can see a huge difference between how the scenario was in 2013 to how it ended in 2018. And if you go back there now, the water is much cleaner, the place has much more trees, and the soil, of course, is healthier. Now, when you come to the African context, most of the agricultural productivity is controlled by smallholder farmers. And their main source of livelihood is actually farming. They farm in difficult circumstances, which are highly heterogeneous in terms of all the dynamics of climate, typologies. Their needs are very different. We also have multiple limitations, and most of it is actually in terms of the natural resources which they depend on, like even rainfall. They have to deal with frequent droughts and frequent flooding. Most do not use resilient practices or technologies. So because of the poverty they experience, they don't have resources sometimes to do high-level farming. They have limited access to training, seeds, and this one I talk especially with regards to tree growing on farm, which in most governments and in most cases is not allocated to a specific ministry. Agriculture has a dedicated ministry, and so is forestry. So we find that extension systems for farmers is usually very lean in most cases. And also the agenda of agroforestry goes unattended. So these people have to deal a lot with low crop yields, crop failure risk, low incomes and poverty, loss of biodiversity, and food insecurity is a major thing. And most drylands in Africa, they have to rely on relief aid. Maine has talked of different agroforestry systems. And here we see a range, and you can see livestock included, because that is a critical system, especially in both the very humid areas and in the drylands. Now, if you look at the general landscape within Africa, tree is part of the system. And therefore, this gives us an opportunity to examine more. What is it that we can do? How can we enhance the systems, the productivity through trees? And this brings me to the evidence of what we have done with synthesis across published information to try and draw, lessons from those documented studies. And one of the key study I'm going to discuss is what we did. It recorded in Kuya 2016, when we looked at trees in agricultural landscapes and how they have provision of ecosystem services in sub-Saharan Africa. And you can see from that map the spread of the studies that we recorded through a systematic review. And generally, 58% of those studies recorded beneficial impacts of trees on the ecosystem services. There was a decline in 15% of the studies, and in 28% of the studies, there were no effects. And if you look at it from this web, you can see in terms of water regulation, in terms of food, because the increase is in the blue, red is the decrease, and the neutral is green, you can actually see are the places where there is great improvement, even soil fertility, water regulation, food, and pest control in a way. And that also shows the distribution, the figure there shows the distribution of studies. So most of the countries in Africa were represented. And so this study is quite representative. Now, moving on from that, we looked at also what is the response ratio. When you say crop yields are increased, that is when you compare the mean of that ecosystem service in the agroforestry to that of the non-agroforestry. So we had crop yields almost doubling, soil fertility, especially N and organic carbon, increasing with available P also in agroforestry systems, runoff and soil loss control 5 times, and even in some cases up to 10 times. Now, in terms of water infiltration, it was higher in agroforestry systems. It is good to note that most of the published studies sometimes, there is that tendency to, send out there the positive results. But what I can say is that when we looked at pest regulation, there are quite a number of negative studies, and therefore, negative impact in some of the practices. But when you look at the practices that I have put there in terms of the hedgerows and in terms of what species you use, you can see that generally there was reduced soil loss. And more information that is the reference. Agroforestry delivers a win-win situation in terms of the ecosystem services. And what is critical in these studies is that management in tree growing is critical to maximize on the benefits of the ecosystem service that you get from trees. Now, recently, around 2023, we looked at the studies more keenly within the Eastern Africa region. And in this case, we focused on carbon sequestration because there is a lot of hype on carbon credits. And we wanted to know what is it? What do the studies record in terms of biomass, in terms of soil carbon, and in terms of the physical benefits? Now, these studies looked at home gardens. We looked at the systems which are tree crops, boundary plantings, woodlots, silvicultural systems, those scattered on farm, etc. And you can see that there is a lot of soil carbon within, the agroforestry systems and also the biomass. And it was strange when we encountered that around the improved fallow, you actually there's very little on the soil carbon, but a lot on biomass, which is an opportunity to see how, more studies in that regard. But more interestingly, we found that the livelihood benefits of food, fodder, firewood, and income were leading. And this is not theoretical because in terms of the work which is ongoing in our work in the Eastern Africa region and in Kenya, this resonates well with the ground findings, the ongoing projects that we are undertaking. How about the economics? Farmers want to do agroforestry as a business. And when you look at the income, economic value of agroforestry system, this one I adopted from Professor Chexbo's presentation, you can see that in terms of the provisioning services, agroforestry is quite competitive. And that includes food, water, raw materials, and genetic resources in terms of medicinal value and ornamental resources. Then the wetlands are critical, and probably this is something more focused also in the wetlands. We have a lot of that in terms of the high values. We also have a lot in terms of regulating for regulatory functions in forests. And that's why the architecture in terms of land uses, how are those land uses located within a landscape? That will help us understand more and accrue most of the benefits that are recorded here. So in total, you can see that agroforestry is very close to forest in terms of the returns, economics in terms of per hectare, USDs per hectare. Maine talks a lot about water, and you know, I am using a scenario whereby within this region, mountains are water towers. And if you look as a scenario like in the Mount Kenya or the Mau forest areas, you find that in the mountain areas, trees in elevated mountainous areas, they regulate the rainfall. And that is where, when there is a lot of destruction and degradation, people downstream usually suffer from water scarcity. Then as you come down, based on the agroforestry and the practices you practice, the situation can become worse or be improved if we integrate trees on farm. And that's why strategic agroforestry along the upstream, downstream gradient maintains hydrological balances. And that is by reducing unwanted, runoff, enhancing infiltration, and increasing the useful, efficient water. And downstream, you find that they create a balanced exchange. And this is where, the studies we are going to look at later on, you can have even reverse flow, where if you are growing trees within agroforestry system, there can be redistribution, hydraulic redistribution of water to the top layers of the cropping zone. Trees for food and nutrition. When you look at malnutrition, there are very high cases, especially in young children. And where do we get most of the nutrients? So trees can enhance nutritional quality in terms of local diets through essential micro and macronutrients and health promoting phytochemicals. If you look at most secondary metabolites, the flavonoids, and all those critical macronutrients, trees have a variety of them. They also complement and diversify stable-based diets. In terms of seasonal availability, they enhance all year-round access. And then most of the trees are drought tolerant. And the other day I was looking at a landscape where we are working during the dry season. The only thing you see around are the trees. So, and those become the main source of the poor farmers around those areas. And then when you do that, you enhance tree cover. And this is work by one of my colleagues, Stefa. And they have been able to do more work, which is like, this is an example of the work they have carried out in Zambia. And you can see the time when they're the peak times on this graph when there is malnutrition, and how they help provide common trees which are found in the locality. So you have customized, you promote diversity, which is customized in terms of micronutrients. And that also includes a combination of indigenous and exotic species. And then there is seasonal availability, and then you can have a calendar. For more, you can refer to the work of Stefan in the publication of 2019. One of the critical in areas in terms of agriculture and food security is energy. And energy is critical not only in food preparation and even in production and value addition. Now, over 2/3 of households in sub-Saharan Africa depend on wood fuel for cooking and heating. And when we talk of wood fuel, we are talking about firewood and charcoal, and that makes 60% of the energy mix in sub-Saharan Africa. The situation is even more dire when you go to the ground and you do site-specific studies, like our current work in Makueni County, where 99% of the households were using firewood, and most of it is sourced on farm, meaning the demand for tree products and especially firewood is high. And if you can have it on farm, that saves a lot of time. And this theory of change, a summary, shows the way we are looking at the whole wood fuel value chain in terms of a sustainable way, in terms of a strategy where you have it in a circular bioeconomy, where you start with wood production, processing, transport, utilization, and they are all those interconnected loops. And for more work and for more understanding, you can refer to the work of my colleague, Mary Jenga, and that publication of 2023. Just to give you a flavor, I want to present a few case studies of the work we have been doing. And one of it, I want to use the Faidebia albida wheat agroforestry systems in Ethiopia. This is work we did for around 10 years with funding from Australian Center for International Agriculture Research. And why Faidebia albida? This is one of the important parkland species in Ethiopia and even in most of the areas in sub-Saharan Africa, including the Sahel. It has a reverse phenology, shedding its leaves during the wet season and also having it on during the dry season. Well, we also have more details on its phenology depending on the context and management. Then you look at its diverse uses ranging from fodder, fencing, firewood, etc. And also it's used a lot in the grazing lands. And these places, we actually have areas where it's used for shade, and therefore you have areas of where nutrient pool, especially from manure, cow dung is very high. So we did studies in terms of the interaction with wheat and productivity. And one of the things which was interesting is in terms of microclimate regulation. Especially during the day when it is very high, we could attain a maximum of 6 degrees centigrade less under the trees. And also in terms of productivity, in terms of the yields, we recorded biomass yields of 30 and 27% of yields in terms of wheat. And as you move away from the tree trunk, the productivity of wheat would decrease. In terms of subflow, in terms of water utilization, we realized that pruning actually reduces water uptake, but not excessive pruning. So what the advice is for the Ethiopian circumstance, excessive pruning, or rather referred to as pollarding, should be discouraged. And we did a lot of training on the right level of pruning and alternative fencing material to provide to reduce overexploitation. And you can refer to our publications on the same for more information. Now we come to coffee systems, which I'll use as an example in Uganda. But coffee is grown all over in Costa Rica, in other parts of Eastern African countries, and it's one of the key export crops. And smallholder farmers in Uganda produce 90% of coffee. And most of it is actually grown under shade in terms of it's shaded coffee grown with trees, because in smallholder farmers, they still need the timber, they still need the firewood. We looked at what is the role of the trees in terms of the productivity of the coffee. And we looked at water balance in terms of water uptake. We looked at the yields, and the yields of coffee under pruned, especially we used albizia, for example, trees, and they produce higher yields. Also pruning prolonged time period for intercropping. meaning there was enough soil moisture, and you could still see farmers who have that, they were planting beans even for 2 seasons. And then it reduces the water demand. But we went beyond that because we need to move farmers from subsistence to having money on their pockets. And we trained them and linked them to the private sector. Which is in the Adelaide, which was at Adelaide, called the Monastery Coffee. So they did the training, farmers how to prune, how to select, and how to manage the coffee. And the value of coffee, what they were selling locally, exceeded by more than two times. I am in touch with my colleague from Makerere University and the team who have been doing that work in Uganda, and this is still in operation. So sustainability, because of addressing the priority needs of the farmers and giving them a livelihood. Last but not least, I cannot go without talking about fruit trees. Kenya has set a very high target of restoring 10.6 million hectares of land, and that they have given about 26.6% to agroforestry, meaning the government has realized the opportunity to plant more trees is so much within farmlands. And therefore, 4 billion of these trees will be grown through agroforestry. And they developed an agroforestry strategy where they have dedicated a whole chapter on growing of fruit trees so that farmers can have income. Avocado, for example, stands as, in Kenya, it is the leading avocado producer and the 6th highest globally. And in 2024, Kenya earned 26.5 billion in terms of avocado production. Now, farmers are encouraged to plant avocado trees. And we did a study in one of the counties where avocado is being planted. And we really looked at the situation. It was dire because farmers were getting the avocado. Sometimes they are not, clear on the varieties. And not only the varieties, but the quality of the seedlings. So, and the spacing, especially management and spacing. And that did not fall under agriculture, and neither did it fall under forestry. So we did a lot of training in terms of variety, in terms of, they were also fetching very little because of middlemen. And therefore, the project intervention was such that we did capacity building. We did capacity building of over 2,500 farmers, but left structures of training of trainers on the ground who are continuing to do training through by aligning that to also the county government priorities. This has enhanced fruit production, led to scaling of trainings, and we were able to even increase the capacity of 25 tree nursery operators. But more inspiring was the formation of the avocado and macadamia cooperative. And in Kiambu County, it has over 1,500 farmers. And they have been able to secure better pricing for their avocado. Previously, they were just selling at 5 shillings. Now it is 20 to 30 shillings per fruit. And they sell in kilos. And they sell directly, they negotiate for good prices. We were also able to train them on how to to estimate the carbon stocks in their farms. And therefore, this is great because they are not exploited. They can negotiate for the carbon markets. And we use a simplified formula on how they can estimate the carbon stock. And there is a reference there on the allometric equations that we developed. I can go on and on, but I really want to leave you with testimonies of some of the farmers we have been working with under a project called Nature-Based Solutions for Land Restoration and funded by FCDO. We have been working in the acyl areas where if you want to grow trees, you have first to provide water. And we thank FCDO because they listened to the needs of the farmers. And we were able to establish farm ponds, in situ water management structures, and change the narrative where they were relying on food aid to being able to produce enough in their farms, go through a dry season, and sell some. I don't have I don't have the photos of home, kitchen gardens that we have established. But these examples, for instance, from if I look at Mary Harrison, she says, give farmers water and see them flourish. We also talked about some of the TOT farmers are already earning from their new skills. And Winfred, for example, who is operating a tree nursery around there and training farmers, she's been able to give grafting services where she gets 50 shillings per tree. That is a lot of money. If you look at the use of, reduction of indoor pollution, beds, for instance, by using ICS chimney, which has a chimney, which we installed in their homes. They have saved on firewood, smoking is gone, and air quality in the kitchen is improved. I also harvest charcoal after cooking to make briquettes. And more inspiring also was from Laikipia County. We did this in schools as a scaling up strategy. And in that, we find that we established a farm pond for the school. We have a nursery, and they are able to grow their crops. And in their school feeding program, they have included vegetables. And they have increased the ratio of maize to beans. Before was 3 maize to 1 bean. Now the ratio is 2:3. And the food has potatoes. It also has vegetables. And so these are very inspiring, and we have many more documented in case study booklets, which we can share. What will I say at the end? The issue is complexity is not to be ignored or diminished, but to be appreciated, understood, and managed. And as we do agroforestry, let us remember the most important person at the center of that, and that is the farmer. So researchers' priorities must be well aligned with farmers' needs for agroforestry to be sustainable. And I want to end there, and thank you so much for listening. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Catherine, and thanks once more, Maina. We're going to jump straight into questions. I have unfortunately a very unstable connection, so it might go at any time. So I have noticed 3 complexes of questions, and Maina, you could perhaps lead off. Sherifdeen and Ramona both are interested in how do you scale adoption, and particularly what incentives could be used. So that's one complex of questions. Catherine, you could follow Maina on that, on scaling from your experience of adoption of agroforestry. What drives that? Adel has asked a very pertinent question about the impact of markets and value chains, and cited the example of Senegal, where mangoes can rot in the field, and Egypt, where they don't occur naturally, but are accessing markets. So we haven't spoken too much, although avocado perhaps does speak a little bit to the value chain markets issue. And Mohammed Abdullah has asked about the links between grazing shrubs and agroforestry. So we didn't touch very much on livestock. So those 3 complexes, if you could sort of alternatively offer some thoughts on these, that will probably take us through to the end of this session. I may have some comments at the end if my connection still holds. So Maina, over to you, and then maybe back and forth with Catherine as well.
Yeah, well, thank you, and thanks for the questions. And I think many of the questions on the scaling of adoption probably became more clear in Catherine's presentation of great examples of that. But I think what we have learned in many cases that rather than starting with positive incentives, we first need to look for what are the negative incentives. And we've seen in many cases that the strong negative incentives for farm-grown timber, because people are not allowed to sell it, and the market is constrained by rules set by forestry institutions meant to protect the forest, and yet preventing people from it. So the first thing has, in many of these cases, have been abolishing these forest-based rules that all trees belong to the state and no farmer is allowed to cut the tree. As soon as farmers are allowed to cut trees, they're actually interested in growing them. And when farmers are not allowed, and that we've seen that in the famous story in Niger, when those rules were sort of forgotten, and suddenly trees came back in the landscape. And we did not have to support nurseries, and we did not have to support many things. And so first of all, look on the negative incentives and where they can be reduced. That will often give a huge boost to farmers growing trees and farmers benefiting from trees. At the same time, there is a lot of course, of benefits in the social sphere. We tend to think that all decision-making is economic, is based on cost and benefits alone. Well, one of our PhD students wrote a paper on you never farm alone. And decision-making at farms is a collective entity where people look for positive social feedback as well as negative feedback that comes within the community. So as soon as someone from the outside has an idea in what should be adopted and tries to impose numbers on local communities, that often does not work. Where we create opportunities and diminish existing bottlenecks, there are many positive examples. At the same time, and that I think brings us to the second case about fruit trees, often are seasonal, and very often in season there is an overproduction for local demand, and things don't work out economically as people want. Yeah, we've seen some beautiful examples where cooperatives emerge that have fruit processing opportunity. There is this Japanese communities in Brazil, which are a famous story of that process many different local fruit trees, add value to that, and because of that support tree diversity within the farms in that area, close to where the current COP on climate change is happening. So yes, of course, there are real challenges on that. At the same time, in many cases, forms of processing can emerge if they are considered well enough and part of the planning. So what is the individual, what is the community scale incentives? Yeah, both exist and both need to be considered. And I think Catherine gave some nice examples. On the grazing, I think, especially on the European side, we see a lot of the agroforestry is actually about grazing. And once you get, can you protect your seedlings from direct grazing damage? They are very well-versed systems, and I think some form of rotational grazing is often needed to protect the young trees from that. But beyond that, I think there are many positive examples coming also from the temperate zone, and including the HESA systems in the Mediterranean, where pigs eating the fruits of the quercus are part of it, etc. So there is a lot on that. And in Southeast Asia, we have not worked as much on that as on the tree crop systems, but there is relevant literature from Latin America, certainly, where these things are prevalent. And I think in Brazil, the commercial eucalyptus growing together with pastures is shown to be very profitable and very attractive for farmers as a way of converting their pastures, and often low-intensity use pastures. So there's a lot of stuff on that front. Maybe, Catherine, you want to add to these stories?
Yes, thank you. Thank you for the questions. Scaling. Why do farmers take up some technologies and refuse to take up some other technologies? Alignment to their priorities and understanding the context is critical. When we were doing the work under the Trees for Food Security project, we realized that grazing, and I like that because grazing has come up. Grazing was one of the challenges in terms of being a barrier to land restoration. And yet, farmers have livestock which they need, and in Ethiopia we have camels. And so we use the strategy of a free grazing strategy because fencing, physical fencing would not work. And if you look at Fidebia, they will use it along, to put it, to protect their seedlings. But when the camel comes, or when the goats, the livestock comes, then it is eaten up. So through the socio fencing and using the existing structures, the farmers were themselves able to come up with regulations. So we have the free grazing strategy, and that is working, seems to have worked then, but also giving farmers alternatives. Because grazing, grass is a big limitation. And that's why they allow their livestock to go. The same thing in Kenya. That is the challenge we have. And much of it also emanates because of use of resources, where upstream users, who are mainly in the humid areas, use the water in a luxurious way and deny downstream users, who are livestock farmers, the water during the dry season. So here in Kenya, we have scenarios where the Maasais will bring the cows to the upstream farmers. And that was evident during the gaming exercises we had. And that's why the Margaret's paper on You Never Farm Alone was also critical. So in terms of scaling, context is important. Using the right extension approaches. We developed scaling strategy which is specific to each country and in each context. So what is applicable to Rwanda was not applicable to Ethiopia, neither was it applicable to Burundi or to Uganda. So we had different scaling up strategies, and the technologies were also different. So context is everything. And lastly, you have to have technologies which are a priority to farmers. If you give farmers something which is of no value to them, you never involved them at the beginning, and then you give them things. We were surprised when we went to Makueni. Most of the farm ponds are not lined, and they remained as such. But when you engage them, then you find a different outcome altogether. And I would refer you to a paper we wrote on farmer-led approaches. When you have farmer-led approaches, there is sustainability in technologies. Fruit trees. Fruit trees, actually, this is where you don't have to tell farmers to plant. Every home has a fruit tree. I am living in town, but I have 3 different fruit trees. I have a pomegranate, I have a mango, I have an avocado, and I have a guava. Those are 4 fruit trees in a small piece of land in my town place. Why do I plant fruit trees? Because I can eat. It's easy. You get it fresh. So the challenge with fruit trees is that they need better extension approaches. They need a whole value chain. And that is why in Kiambu County, when our entry point was, farmers are getting very little and getting demoralized. So we were able to link them to market. They were able to form a cooperative. In Makueni County, there is a whole Kalembe. The county started a processing plant for the mangoes. But we can do a range of options which farmers can do, even at the farm level, like drying of fruits. Now there are solar dryers. We can create partnerships with people who are doing drying in our projects, and that will make the farmer to be the winner. And the land restoration will be a reality. And the food security issue challenges that we talk about will become a myth because we have taken care of the custodian of that land, and that is the farmer. Thank you very much.
I don't know if Ravi's connection is finally given up. You're on mute, Ravi.
Michelle, I think we've gone all through the topics. Maybe you're right. Maybe Ravi has lost his connection. Doctor, yeah, go.
Back briefly, just to say thank you to our two speakers, and at one stage we have 100 participants. Thank you for all the participation. As I think Adil was noting, I have a very bad connection. We can go on this topic for a long time, and I'm glad that there was so much interest. I would recommend those of you who have not accessed the information on the C4 Aircraft website to try and do that. I can see my connection is unstable again. Thank you to everybody. I will invite Maine, Catherine, and perhaps Adil to say a last few words. I will stop now because you probably can't hear me anyway.
Well, we could hear you, Ravi. So thanks very much for inviting us for this talk. Yeah, as you said, we could go on for another hour or even more. There's a lot of practical issues around agroforestry, and the challenge is that agroforestry has so many different forms in so many different contexts. So within a country, within a region, you have more to share than at the global scale. At the same time, we just had the World Agro-Forestry Congress in Rwanda, and there's another big one coming up in 3 years' time. So there's a community out there sharing things and sharing ideas, and both Catherine and people I can connect with you would be helpful, willing to help you to connect with universities and partners in the different parts of the world. So good luck for everyone, and please keep enthusiastic about the trees on the farm and around our houses. Thank you. Catherine, you're still muted.
Mine. Okay.
Go ahead.
Okay, mine is to say thank you very much for an opportunity to share our experiences, and wherever you are coming from and tuning in, the call should be that let us be the ambassadors. If you preach agroforestry and you don't practice agroforestry, if we came to your place in the rural area or in your town, you talk about agroforestry and you don't practice it, how will you understand what the farmers and those people you preach it to go through? So there are a lot of resources out there, and we can make farmers benefit from agroforestry, not only in terms of restoration, because restoration is for who? Let them see themselves as stakeholders in this by being beneficiaries, especially economically, and a transformation in their livelihoods. Thank you.
Ravi, just I want to say what a great lectures we had with you, both Dr. Maine and Dr. Catherine. We all know much more about agroforestry than before starting this webinar. Thank you very much. Ravi? We probably lost Ravi. So thank you very much. It's time to close this webinar. Thank you, Dr. Catherine. Thank you, Dr. Maine. And thank you, Dr. Ravi, for organizing all this webinar and taking all the effort. Thank you. Bye. Bye.
Bye.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.